$300 million. That is the price of blind loyalty. In mid-April 2026, the most aggressive economic siege ever engineered against the Sahel completely imploded. Not from military force, but from a massive financial mutiny. According to intelligence forecasts, the containment framework was supposed to break Ibrahim Traoré within 12 months. It was designed as a perfect geopolitical prison. No access to the Atlantic, no industrial components, no survival. But the architects of this blockade forgot one crucial detail. The system required transit nations to bleed their own economies dry. For decades, the port of Lomé handled 75% of Burkina Faso's maritime trade. The sanctions demanded that this vital artery be permanently severed. But economic reality always destroys colonial theory. Faced with catastrophic losses, Togo officially operationalized the direct Sahel transit corridor. They didn't just open a road, they dismantled a weapon of mass economic control. Within 48 hours, over 500 transport trucks surged across the border, completely shattering the embargo. If you are African, you have been told your whole life that defying the old geopolitical order leads to ruin. This is the absolute proof that they were wrong. The siege is broken. The framework is collapsing. Let me show you exactly how the money tore their master plan to shreds. When you think of warfare, you think of soldiers. You think of artillery. But the most destructive weapons don't make a sound. They don't leave craters in the earth. They look like paperwork. They look like customs declarations, frozen bank accounts, and chained up shipping containers. This is how the containment framework operates. It is a silent bureaucratic mechanism designed to suffocate sovereign nations without firing a single shot. And in 2026, this framework was deployed with absolute ruthlessness against the alliance of Sahel states. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger share a geographical reality. They are landlocked. They do not have direct access to the ocean. For decades, this geography was managed through regional cooperation. It was a logistical challenge, but it was never supposed to be a weapon. Then the political winds shifted. Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani decided that the old extractive arrangements were no longer acceptable. They demanded total sovereignty. They began removing figures aligned with external interests. The response from the architects of the old order was swift and it was brutal. According to trade analysts who have studied the sanctions, the objective was never diplomacy. The objective was total economic paralysis. To understand the massive scale of this operation, you have to look at the map. You have to look at the port of Lomé in Togo. Lomé is not just a port. It is the beating heart of West African transit. Records indicate that historically, up to 75% of Burkina Faso's maritime trade flowed through this single coastal access point. 75%. Let that sink in. Everything from heavy industrial machinery and fuel to basic agricultural inputs and medical supplies depended on the Lomé corridor. It was the absolute lifeline for millions of people. The containment framework identified this dependency not as a trade route, but as a pressure point, a critical vulnerability to be ruthlessly exploited. The strategy was devastatingly simple. Close the port, block the roads, cut the financial wires, starve the resistance. Western media networks consistently framed these measures as a standard diplomatic tool to encourage stability. They were wrong. The documented reality reveals a calculated campaign of starvation logistics. Reports suggest that intelligence agencies and financial architects drafted a strict 12-month countdown. They calculated exactly how long the alliance of Sahel states could survive before their sovereign reserves dried up. They knew precisely when their supply chains would snap, and they anticipated when the sheer lack of basic goods would force the populations to turn against their own leadership. 12 months. That was the magic number. That was the timeline for surrender. To enforce this 12-month death sentence, the framework weaponized the very institutions designed to integrate Africa. Regional economic blocs were transformed into enforcement agencies. According to shipping manifests reviewed from the period, the embargo didn't just target military hardware. It targeted the foundations of a modern state. Transformers needed for power grids were halted. Water purification chemicals were delayed. Agricultural fertilizers, essential for the upcoming planting season, were left sitting in shipping yards under the tropical sun. This wasn't collateral damage. This was the core design of the containment framework. If you destroy the infrastructure, you destroy the sovereignty. What does a starvation strategy actually look like on the ground? It looks like miles of transport trucks sitting idle at the border crossings. It looks like essential medical supplies expiring in transit warehouses. It looks like infrastructure and construction projects grinding to an absolute halt because cement, steel, and machinery are trapped in a bureaucratic limbo hundreds of miles away. Did you know that the economic damage of these blockades often exceeds the GDP output of entire cities? Most people don't. The architects of the containment framework knew exactly what they were doing. They were leveraging geography to enforce submission. According to leaked logistical briefings, the blockade was designed to be completely airtight. Every neighboring coastal state aligned with the framework was expected to enforce the embargo with absolute strictness, regardless of the domestic costs. The system demanded total obedience. If you were a transit nation, you were required to sacrifice your own economic activity to punish the Sahel. And for a while, the system appeared to hold. The pressure built up inside Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, just as the foreign analysts had predicted. But the analysts sitting in distant financial capitals made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They assumed the framework was immune to the laws of basic economics. Togo had spent years positioning Lomé as the premier deepwater port of the region. They had invested heavily in automated terminals and highway infrastructure specifically to serve the landlocked markets of the Sahel. The framework was now demanding that Togo voluntarily shut down its most profitable economic engine. They assumed that the transit nations would simply absorb the massive, crippling financial losses required to maintain the siege. They were demanding that a country destroy its own logistics and transit industry to serve an external geopolitical agenda. This is the fundamental arrogance of the neocolonial machine. It treats African economies as disposable tools. The framework required Togo to bleed. It required them to turn away thousands of commercial shipments. It forced them to lose out on massive port fees, transit taxes, and long-term logistics contracts. They were told to sacrifice their own prosperity to maintain a blockade that did not serve their national interest. And this is exactly where the 12-month timeline began to fatally fracture. Because while the alliance of Sahel states was undeniably feeling the pressure of the embargo, the enforcers of the blockade were quietly bleeding cash. Massive, unsustainable amounts of cash. The architects of the siege were so obsessively focused on breaking Ibrahim Traoré that they didn't realize they were bankrupting their own enforcement mechanism. But to understand why the blockade ultimately collapsed, you have to look at the specific numbers that were being quietly ignored. Records indicate that enforcing this blockade didn't just isolate the Sahel, it triggered a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. The system cost the transit infrastructure an estimated $300 million in lost revenue. $300 million. We are going to break down exactly how this staggering loss forced Togo to choose between economic survival and the demands of the containment framework. But when the financial pain reached an absolute breaking point, who actually made the call to shatter the embargo? And what happened in the hours immediately after? $300 million. It is not an abstract figure on a spreadsheet. It is the lifeblood of a national economy. According to maritime reports from early 2026, the sanctions were bleeding the port of Lomé dry. The containment framework expected Togo to simply accept this. They expected a sovereign African nation to cheerfully bankrupt its most profitable sector to serve an external agenda. They were wrong. For years, the architects of the siege operated under a fatal delusion. They believed that colonial loyalty, or at least the fear of diplomatic retaliation, would always override economic self-interest. They believed that African leaders would always prioritize the approval of foreign capitals over the survival of their own domestic industries. But the math stopped adding up. When you are losing hundreds of millions of dollars in transit fees, customs duties, and logistics contracts, you don't need a geopolitical lecture. You need a solution. Records indicate that the Togo Transit Corridor was not just a road. It was an entire ecosystem of wealth generation. Truck drivers, freight forwarders, warehouse operators, and port workers all relied on the steady flow of goods heading north to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The framework demanded that all of these people be put out of work. Why? To punish Ibrahim Traoré, to enforce a blockade that was drafted thousands of miles away. Togo looked at the balance sheet. They looked at the 12-month starvation timeline, and they realized something profoundly dangerous for the old world order. The blockade was an act of economic suicide. It is easy to enforce a siege when you are sitting in a comfortable office in a foreign capital. It is entirely different when your own citizens are paying the price. According to internal economic assessments, the transit nations were absorbing the shockwaves of the embargo. The containment framework had designed a system where the punishment fell disproportionately on the African enforcers, while the foreign architects paid nothing. This is the defining characteristic of neocolonial strategy. Privatize the power, socialize the pain. Think about the sheer arrogance of this design. The framework effectively ordered a regional neighbor to act as a prison guard, and then demanded that the guard pay for the prison's upkeep out of their own pocket. It is a fundamentally flawed model, and it was bound to snap. According to financial analysts, Togo was facing a terrifying long-term risk. The alliance of Sahel's states was not just sitting idly by. They were actively seeking alternative partnerships. They were looking at routes through other territories, striking deals with nations outside the immediate sphere of the framework's influence. If Togo waited too long to break the embargo, they wouldn't just lose $300 million in the short term. They risked losing their 75% market share forever. The architects of the containment framework never factored in this competitive pressure. They treated the African logistics market as a captive audience. They assumed the Sahel had nowhere else to go, and Togo had no choice but to comply. Reports indicate that the Togolese administration recognized this existential threat. They realized that the true danger wasn't diplomatic isolation from the West. The true danger was becoming permanently irrelevant to the rising economic bloc in their own backyard. President Faure Gnassingbé and his administration saw the writing on the wall. They had two choices. They could maintain the blockade, watch their premier deep-water port lose its competitive edge, and face massive domestic economic fallout. Or they could break ranks. They chose survival. In mid-April, the pivot became official. Togo formally operationalized a direct Sahel transit corridor for the Alliance of Sahel States. They bypassed the mandates of the regional framework. They explicitly guaranteed unimpeded access to the Atlantic Ocean for the landlocked nations. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for a consensus from the external powers. They simply opened the gates. Did you know that regional integration was supposed to be about mutual prosperity? Most people forget that. The containment framework had twisted regional blocs into weapons of collective punishment. Togo's pivot was a devastating rejection of that twisted logic. This wasn't just a loophole. This was a total structural collapse of the containment strategy. When a key transit nation realizes that the sanctions are fundamentally flawed, the entire wall crumbles. The framework relies on unanimous compliance. One crack and the water rushes in. Analysts have observed that this pivot completely nullifies the predictions made by foreign intelligence. The 12-month timeline to break the Sahel was based on the assumption that the transit nations would remain obedient, no matter the cost. By prioritizing their own logistical networks over Western diplomatic pressure, Togo effectively shattered that timeline. They proved that the framework is not an invincible machine. It is a fragile house of cards built on the assumption of African subservience. Documents suggest that the architects of the siege scrambled to patch the leak. They deployed diplomatic pressure. They issued subtle warnings. But it was too late. The corridor was greenlit. This is the fatal flaw of weaponizing economics. If you make the cost of obedience higher than the cost of rebellion, people will rebel. Togo didn't pivot out of a sudden surge of revolutionary zeal. They didn't do it to write a new chapter in Pan-African poetry. They did it because the containment framework is bad for business. And in the modern geopolitical arena, cold, hard capitalism often cuts through colonial illusions faster than any political speech. The moment the port authorities in Lomé received the signal to process the stranded cargo, the entire dynamic of West Africa shifted. The paper was signed. The barriers were lifted. The mutiny wasn't ideological, it was financial, and the fallout was immediate. According to foreign intelligence reports, the alliance of Sahel states was supposed to suffer a total economic collapse within 12 months. 12 months. That was the official countdown. We are breaking down exactly how that meticulously planned timeline was completely obliterated by a single logistical decision. The framework was shattered. The port was open. But when the barricades were finally lifted, what actually happened on the ground in the first 48 hours? The gates open. It is one thing to sign a piece of paper in a capital city. It is an entirely different thing to witness the physical reality of a blockade collapsing on the ground. In mid-April, the border between Togo and Burkina Faso transformed from a choke point into a massive pulsing artery. According to logistical reports reviewed from the ground, the response was immediate. It was an absolute blitz. Over 500 transport trucks had been stranded. They were sitting in dusty lots, their engines cold, their cargo trapped in the bureaucratic purgatory of the containment framework. Then the signal was given. Within 48 hours, those 500 trucks surged across the border. 500 trucks in 2 days. Think about the sheer scale of that movement. Think about the sound of hundreds of heavy diesel engines firing up, breaking the silence of an embargo that was supposed to last forever. This wasn't a slow, hesitant trickle of humanitarian aid permitted by a generous overseer. This was a massive, coordinated logistical strike. And what were they carrying? This is the detail that truly terrified the architects of the siege. They weren't just carrying emergency food rations. According to shipping manifests and customs data, these convoys were loaded with vital industrial components. They were carrying heavy machinery. They were carrying steel. They were carrying electrical transformers, construction materials, and the raw inputs required to keep a nation's infrastructure running. The containment framework was designed to push Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger back into the dark ages. It was designed to freeze their development, to halt their power grids, and to make basic modern survival impossible without foreign permission. Those 500 trucks proved that the Sahel was not going to be deindustrialized. If you are watching this, and you share the vision of a truly sovereign Africa, you need to understand the absolute weight of this moment. You are not just a spectator to this history. You are the reason they are fighting it. For generations, the narrative has been that we cannot manage our own logistics, that we cannot survive without the paternalistic oversight of the old colonial systems. Those trucks crossing the border weren't just carrying cargo, they were carrying the absolute destruction of that narrative. They were carrying the undeniable proof that African nations can and will engineer their own survival. Let's look back at what the experts confidently predicted. Remember the 12-month starvation timeline drafted by foreign intelligence? Remember the absolute certainty that Ibrahim Traoré and the alliance of Sahel states would be forced to their knees because they lacked coastal access? That timeline was vaporized in 48 hours. The analysts who designed the containment framework failed to understand the sheer administrative and logistical capability of the alliance. Western media often portrays these governments as isolated, chaotic administrations. But you do not move 500 heavy transport trucks across an international border in 2 days with chaos. You do it with precision. You do it with intense, coordinated planning between the port authorities in Lomé and the customs officials in Ouagadougou. Records indicate that the Sahel states had been quietly preparing for this exact pivot. They had the drivers on standby. They had the administrative pathways cleared. The moment Togo mutinied against the $300 million financial bleeding we discussed earlier, the Sahel was ready to execute. It was a masterclass in operational readiness. For over 60 years, the flow of goods through West African ports was carefully regulated to ensure that true industrial independence was never achieved. The containment framework didn't just appear in 2026. It was the modern iteration of a very old, very dark system of control. It relied on keeping neighbors divided. It relied on turning regional borders into weapons of economic warfare. But the drivers, the logistics operators, the warehouse managers, they are the unsung heroes of this mutiny. They weren't politicians sitting in air-conditioned rooms. They were the ones who sat in their cabs for weeks, watching their livelihoods evaporate, waiting for the political courage to match the economic reality. When the barricades lifted, it was a release of kinetic energy that shook the entire region. The physical movement of those 500 trucks was the physical manifestation of sovereignty. The architects of the siege were completely blindsided. They had spent decades building the containment framework. They had weaponized regional treaties. They had threatened banking sectors. They had done everything in their power to make the ocean inaccessible to the resistance. And it all collapsed because they underestimated the basic economic reality of trade and the unyielding willpower of a region that simply refused to die. When the first convoys arrived in Burkina Faso, the psychological impact was immeasurable. A blockade is as much a psychological weapon as it is an economic one. It is designed to induce despair. It is meant to make the population look at the empty shelves, the stalled construction sites, and the flickering power grids, and blame their own leaders for defying the external powers. The framework relies entirely on manufacturing hopelessness, but when the supply chains reconnected, that hopelessness vanished. It was replaced by a dangerous, electrifying realization. The realization that the neocolonial machine is not invincible. The realization that the old world order can be defied and you can actually win. Reports suggest that the speed of this logistical blitz caused absolute panic in the foreign capitals that had sponsored the sanctions. They had no contingency plan for this. They had no backup strategy for a scenario where a key transit nation prioritized its own economy over the geopolitical goals of the framework. What could they do? Sanction Togo? Blockade the port of Lomé? If they tried to punish Togo for opening the corridor, they would only accelerate the total fracturing of their influence in West Africa. They would be declaring economic war on the very coastal states they rely on to project power. They were trapped in a paradox of their own making. The containment framework was exposed as a hollow threat. It only worked if the African nations agreed to enforce it against themselves. Once Togo refused to play the role of the prison guard, the prison ceased to exist. This 4 to 8 hour blitz wasn't just a tactical victory for Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani. It was a strategic humiliation for the forces that tried to break them. It proved that the alliance of Sahel states is not a temporary anomaly. It is a permanent, functioning geopolitical reality. They have an army. They have a mutual defense pact. And now they have a guaranteed sanction-proof logistical artery to the global market. They have achieved what the foreign analysts said was mathematically impossible. They have secured their economic lifeline without compromising their sovereignty. But the story does not end with the arrival of those trucks. The opening of the Lomé corridor was a massive shock to the system. It was the moment the dam broke. The first 48 hours rewrote the geopolitical map, but the long-term consequences are even more terrifying for the architects of the siege. Over 500 trucks in 48 hours. We just showed you how the Alliance of Sahel states completely dismantled the 12-month starvation timeline with a massive logistical blitz. They didn't just break the blockade, they broke the psychology of the siege. But the arrival of those trucks in Ouagadougou wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of an entirely new era. The containment framework isn't just leaking, it is fundamentally shattering. How does the opening of this single transit corridor permanently rewrite the rules of survival for the entire African continent? The 500 trucks that crossed the border into Burkina Faso did more than deliver cargo. They delivered a fatal blow to the ultimate weapon of the old world order. For decades, the architects of global finance believed they had perfected the art of invisible warfare. They didn't need to deploy troops. They didn't need to launch airstrikes. They simply weaponized the global banking system and regional transit corridors. This was the true power of the containment framework. It was the ultimate deterrent. It was the threat that hung over the head of every African leader who dared to speak about genuine sovereignty. The message was always the same. Defy us and we will cut you off from the world. We will freeze your assets, block your ports, and starve your economy until you are forced to step down. But what happens when the deterrent fails? What happens when a nation calls the bluff, endures the pain, and actually survives? According to geopolitical analysts observing the region, the opening of the Lomé corridor is not just a regional anomaly. It is a catastrophic system failure for the architects of the siege. They played their strongest card against Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani. They deployed the absolute maximum level of economic pressure. And it wasn't enough. We need to look back at that $300 million mutiny. That number is the key to understanding the total collapse of the strategy. The containment framework relied entirely on the assumption that African states could be forced to act against their own economic interests to appease foreign powers. It relied on the illusion that political pressure from distant capitals was more important than regional trade. Togo proved that this assumption is fundamentally obsolete. When you force a sovereign nation to choose between colonial loyalty and national bankruptcy, they will eventually choose survival. This is why the framework is not just failing. It is actively self-destructing. It is a suicidal weapon. It inflicts massive, unsustainable damage on the very regional allies required to enforce it. Records indicate that other transit nations in West Africa are closely monitoring the fallout of Togo's pivot. They are looking at their own balance sheets. They are looking at the idle transport fleets and the empty warehouse districts caused by their participation in the embargo. And they are asking themselves a very dangerous question. Why are we bleeding our own economies dry to enforce a blockade that clearly isn't working? This is the domino effect that terrifies the external powers. The containment framework requires absolute unity to function. If multiple transit nations realize that the sanctions are economically toxic, the entire enforcement mechanism disintegrates. By breaking the blockade, the Alliance of Sahel states has achieved something unprecedented in modern African history. They are building a sanction-proof economy. Think about the magnitude of that achievement. For a landlocked nation, access to the sea is access to the world. It is the prerequisite for industrialization. It is the baseline for economic independence. The architects of the siege tried to use geography as a cage. They tried to turn the lack of a coastline into a fatal vulnerability. But the Sahel Alliance flipped the script. By securing a guaranteed unimpeded transit corridor that operates outside the dictates of the containment framework, they have neutralized the ultimate weapon of external control. Documents suggest that the alliance is not stopping at just one port. The Lome corridor is the blueprint. They are establishing dedicated logistical arteries that prioritize regional integration over foreign alignment. They are building supply chains that cannot be suddenly shut down by a phone call from a foreign capital. This is what true structural decolonization looks like. It is not just about changing the flag or rewriting the national anthem. It is about controlling the flow of goods, the movement of capital, and the infrastructure of survival. Let's go back to the fundamental mechanics of the siege. The architects of the containment framework relied heavily on manipulating regional integration. They took institutions that were originally designed to foster African unity and twisted them into enforcement agencies. They turned neighbors into wardens. They calculated that the cultural and historical ties between the coastal states and the Sahel could be severed if the financial threats were severe enough. It was a deeply cynical view of African solidarity. They assumed that unity was just a talking point, and that when the pressure mounted, every nation would scramble to protect its own relationship with the foreign capital. Togo's mutiny destroyed that cynical calculation. It proved that there is a breaking point where the demands of the neocolonial machine become so destructive, so obviously contrary to the survival of the region, that compliance becomes impossible. The $300 million loss was not just an economic statistic. It was the exact price at which the illusion of the framework shattered. According to economic observers, the failure of this strategy sends a glaring signal to the rest of the global South. It shows that the ultimate weapon of the old geopolitical order is actually highly vulnerable. It relies on the passive obedience of the target's neighbors. If those neighbors refuse to participate in the starvation of their own region, the entire siege architecture collapses. This changes the strategic calculus for any sovereign nation currently facing the threat of sanctions. It provides a living, breathing case study in how to break an embargo. You don't need to defeat the architects of the siege in a direct confrontation. You just need to offer their regional enforcers a better economic deal. This is exactly what the Alliance of Sahel States accomplished. They didn't just survive the blockade. They outmaneuvered it. They leveraged the sheer economic gravity of their market to break the political chains designed to bind them. And what does this mean for the populations of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger? For 12 months, they were the targets of a psychological war. The framework wanted them to look at the rising prices, the scarcity of goods, and the stalled infrastructure, and blame their sovereign leaders. The goal was to weaponize civilian hardship to force a change in administration. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of turning against their leadership, the populations understood exactly who was turning the screws. They saw the containment framework for what it was, an external mechanism of collective punishment. When the Lome corridor opened and the convoys of industrial components began to arrive, it wasn't just a logistical relief. It was a massive validation of their endurance. It proved that their suffering was not in vain, and that their leaders had correctly called the bluff of the external powers. The psychological victory is arguably even more significant than the economic one. The fear of the framework has been permanently broken. The old world order has lost its mystique. It has lost its aura of invincibility. If a coalition of landlocked, supposedly impoverished nations can successfully defy the most aggressive economic containment strategy of the modern era, then the rules of global power have fundamentally shifted. The architects of the siege are now standing over the wreckage of their own strategy. They spent decades building a complex web of economic dependencies, and it was dismantled by the basic, undeniable gravity of African trade. The framework is fracturing and the ripple effects are already reaching shores far beyond the Atlantic. We have watched a system shatter. For decades, they told us that geography was destiny. They said that landlocked nations would always be at the mercy of the coastal powers. They lied. The events of mid-April 2026 and the collapse of the Sahel blockade leave us with three undeniable truths. The first truth is about the reality of trade. According to economic observers, the $300 million mutiny in Togo proved that artificial boundaries cannot permanently cage economic gravity. The containment framework was built on a delusion. It assumed that African nations would willingly bleed their own economies dry to serve the geopolitical interests of foreign capitals. The illusion of colonial loyalty evaporated the exact moment the financial reality hit the ledger. You cannot feed your people with the diplomatic approval of a distant empire. Togo chose survival, and in doing so exposed the fundamental weakness of the entire containment strategy. The second truth is about the physical nature of freedom. Sovereignty is not a speech, it is logistics. It is the ability to move 500 heavy transport trucks across a border in 48 hours without asking for permission. The Alliance of Sahel states understood that true independence is measured in supply chains. It is measured in access to the ocean, the uninterrupted flow of industrial components, and the physical capacity to survive a siege. They didn't just break a blockade. They secured the literal arteries of their future. They proved that decolonization requires infrastructure. It requires the roads, the ports, and the administrative willpower to keep the engines running when the rest of the world tries to shut you down. And that leads to the third and most dangerous truth. The ultimate weapon of the old world order is dead. The architects of economic warfare relied on a very specific type of psychological manipulation. They needed African nations to police each other. They needed Togo to act as the warden of a geopolitical prison. By choosing regional trade over foreign obedience, Togo provided a masterclass to the entire global South. The siege fails the moment the enforcers refuse to inflict the pain. The framework only had power because the transit nations agreed to participate in their own regional destruction. Once that participation was withdrawn, the most aggressive economic embargo of the modern era dissolved into thin air. This is why this moment is absolutely critical. We are not just witnessing a diplomatic shift. We are witnessing the autopsy of a neocolonial machine. Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani called the biggest bluff in modern geopolitical history. They were threatened with 12 months of starvation. They were told their economies would collapse. They responded by rewriting the map of West African trade. The era of the enforced embargo is over. The era of the sovereign corridor has begun. If the sheer scale of this economic mutiny makes you realize how fragile their control actually is, you have a responsibility. The mainstream networks will never give you the autopsy of their own failed strategies. They will try to bury these numbers. They want you to believe the framework is still invincible. Take this analysis, send it to your networks, share it in your circles. Let the evidence of this collapsed machine spread faster than their narrative of despair. The truth about our sovereignty belongs to all of us. But the battle for logistical independence is only half the equation. To truly understand how the Alliance of Sahel states is making their economies completely untouchable, you need to see what they are doing to the financial architecture. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover how the gold reserves are being weaponized to break the final chains of the old banking system. I will see you there.